Hello everybody, welcome to Behind the Battle channel. Help subscribe, like and share please. When speaking about the great civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean, one cannot overlook a small but deeply influential ethnic group in human history, particularly in the realms of psychology and religion, the Jewish people. Understanding the ancient Jews is key to grasping the roots of the ongoing conflict in the modern Middle East. Although they lived near the Mediterranean Sea, the ancient Jews were not seafaring people like the Greeks, Cretans, or Phoenicians. Instead, they were a tribal, nomadic people, following the patterns of prehistoric society, moving between the regions of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The history of the Jewish people began over 3,000 years ago when, according to their own sacred texts, they fled slavery in Egypt and journeyed across the desert toward their ancestral homeland, present-day Israel and Palestine. This journey is vividly recorded in the Jewish Torah and the Old Testament of Christianity, though historians and archaeologists still debate the factual accuracy of these accounts. In the land of Canaan, the Jews, also known as the Hebrews, began practicing agriculture and established their own kingdom. Eventually, they founded a sacred city, Jerusalem. To their south lived the Philistines, a long-standing enemy of the Jews. Jerusalem was later destroyed by the Babylonians in 508 BCE, and the Jewish people were exiled to Babylon. Only after the Persian Empire conquered Babylon were the Jews allowed to return to their homeland. Then, in 63 BCE, the Roman Empire took control of Israel and much of the surrounding region. Unwilling to live under Roman rule, the Jews revolted. But the rebellion was crushed by Roman forces, Jerusalem was destroyed once again, and the Jews were expelled from their land. The Romans renamed the entire region Palestine, a name derived from the Philistines, historical enemies of the Jews, as a form of punishment and erasure of Jewish identity. From that time, over 2,000 years ago, the Jewish people scattered across the world, forming small communities, especially throughout Europe. They were unable to return to their ancestral land. By the 16th century, extreme nationalism began to rise across Europe, along with growing antisemitism. These events deeply unsettled European Jews, who began to fear for their safety. This fear sparked a new political movement, the desire to establish their own Jewish nation. Many longed to return to their ancestral homeland, Palestine, which, by the 15th and 16th centuries, had faded from political prominence. By the late 19th century, a Jewish man named Theodor Herzl founded a movement called Zionism. This movement arose in response to the increasing antisemitism in Europe and aimed to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. After World War II, that vision began to take shape. Extreme nationalism and the rise of antisemitism in Europe. In Europe, extreme nationalism and deep-rooted hatred toward the Jewish people began to intensify. This hatred ultimately gave rise to a brutal and systematic movement to exterminate Jews, which originated in Germany and spread across other parts of Europe under the Nazi regime led by Adolf Hitler, one of the most infamous dictators in world history. Hitler's genocide against the Jewish population in Germany stemmed from his personal hatred and prejudice. Once he seized power, he quickly issued orders to arrest thousands of Jews and send them to various concentration camps. In the territories he controlled, he repeatedly ordered the extermination of Jews. As the German army invaded Russia and held territory there for some time, Hitler's forces continued their systematic execution of Jews. In every village they entered, mobile Nazi units would round up all Jewish residents, including women and children, force them to gather near mass graves, and execute them with machine guns. Those who survived the shootings were either beaten to death or buried alive to conserve bullets. Hitler saw this method as too slow, so he ordered the construction of over 30 concentration camps across Europe. These became known as death camps. Jews were rounded up from all corners of the continent, packed into train cars designed for livestock or freight, and transported to these camps. At death camps like Dachau, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen, and Buchenwald, and especially at Auschwitz, the deadliest of them all, victims were denied food and water and subjected to horrific abuse. Before entering the camps, many were beaten and tortured. Some were tied to stones and clubbed to death. Guards often hanged prisoners by their wrists until they died. Children were thrown into furnaces or large pots of boiling water. Some were grabbed by the legs and had their heads smashed against trees. There were even cases where children were disemboweled alive in front of their parents, and the killers celebrated as they carried out these atrocities. At one camp in France, all prisoners had their eyes gouged out, then had hot iron rods inserted and their eyelids sewn shut. To speed up the killings, Hitler instructed German chemists to create gas chambers capable of killing up to 2,000 people at once. Large crematoriums were also built to burn the corpses efficiently. Hitler declared that prisoners should not die easily. Instead, they must suffer. To that end, guards were ordered to spray prisoners with acid that peeled their skin before executing them. The birth of Zionism. These horrifying atrocities eventually led Jewish survivors to form a political movement known as Zionism, led by Theodor Herzl. One part of Jerusalem, in the region of Palestine, was historically known as Zion, the symbolic center of the Jewish homeland. The goal of the Zionist movement was to gather Jews from all over the world, especially from Europe, and establish a nation of their own on the land of Palestine. By 1914, just before the outbreak of World War I, around 85,000 Jews had migrated to Palestine and settled there. 3 years later, in 1917, Britain became the first country to formally support the Zionist movement. This move had long-lasting consequences for the region of the Middle East. In that same year, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour publicly endorsed the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, a declaration that would shape the course of regional history for decades to come. The Arab response and the road to war. From that moment on, the Arab population in the region of ancient Phoenicia began to harbor deep resentment toward the British Empire, which at the time held significant influence in the Middle East. They opposed further Jewish immigration and fought to prevent Jews from settling in the land of Palestine. To the Jewish people, however, Britain's 1917 Balfour Declaration was seen as an official endorsement of their national aspirations. This declaration ignited a new sense of hope among Jews, who now believed that the dream of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine was no longer just a fantasy, it was a real possibility. After the end of World War I, the League of Nations granted Britain and France the authority to administer different parts of the Middle East. Britain took control of Palestine, while France governed Lebanon and Syria. Between 1920 and 1939, the Jewish population in Palestine rose dramatically from just 10,000 to over 470,000. By comparison, the Arab population in the region was fewer than 600,000. As a result, tensions between Jews and Arabs escalated, and by the time World War II began in 1939, major figures had already emerged in what would become a deep and violent ethnic conflict. Powerful foreign powers, too, had become involved in this volatile situation, each with its own agenda. The Jews, through the Zionist movement, sought to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The local Arabs, along with neighboring Arab states, were determined to stop this from happening. Meanwhile, outside powers aimed to maintain their dominance over the region. After World War II, the urgency to establish a Jewish state became more pressing than ever before. The horrors of the Holocaust, orchestrated by Nazi Germany, drove thousands of Jewish survivors across Europe and America to seek refuge in Palestine. Many were welcomed and supported by the Jewish Agency in Palestine, then led by David Ben-Gurion. The birth of Israel and the outbreak of war. When Israel declared its independence on May 14, 1948, the neighboring Arab countries immediately launched a military response. Within just one day, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon declared war on the newly founded state of Israel. Their mission was clear: to destroy Israel and erase it from the map of the Middle East. But things didn't go as expected. Contrary to their hopes, the Arab coalition was defeated in this first Arab-Israeli war. The conflict came to an end in February 1949, with Israel having not only survived but also expanded its territory. The defeat left the Arab states humiliated and enraged. They could not forget the pain of their failure. Determined to seek revenge, they began rearming, strengthening their military forces, and preparing for the day they would once again confront Israel in battle. The road to the Six-Day War. In Israel, Minister of Labor and Social Welfare Golda Meir took action to support the influx of Jewish immigrants arriving from across the globe. She launched a housing program to provide shelter and stability for these new arrivals, many of whom had survived war and persecution. Just 5 years later, in 1954, the tension escalated once again. Egypt, under the leadership of General Gamal Abdel Nasser, took the lead among Arab nations in preparing for a military confrontation with Israel. Nasser developed a strategy of encirclement, aiming to isolate and eventually crush Israel. To carry out this plan, Egypt worked to establish military alliances with neighboring Arab states, seeking to surround Israel with hostile forces on all sides. Their objective was clear: to eliminate Israel once and for all. But things did not go as Egypt had hoped. As tensions built and the threat of war loomed, Israel struck preemptively. In what became known as the Six-Day War, Israel launched a swift and decisive military campaign. The Arab forces were overwhelmed and the war ended in a stunning defeat for Egypt and its allies. In March 1967, the Israeli military began preparing a preemptive strike against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The operation lasted only 6 days, unfolding with astonishing speed, far beyond expectations. This conflict, known as the Six-Day War, was the second major Arab-Israeli war, also referred to as the June War of 1967. It involved Israel and a coalition of neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Other Arab nations, including Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria, also sent troops in support of the Arab alliance. In May 1967, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser ordered the withdrawal of United Nations peacekeeping forces from the Sinai Peninsula, forces that had been stationed there since 1956 following the Suez Crisis. Egypt then mobilized around 1,000 tanks and 200,000 troops along the border with Israel and closed the Straits of Tiran, blocking Israel's access to key energy supplies. Nasser also called on Arab nations to unite against Israel. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive airstrike against Egypt's air force. Jordan, which had signed a mutual defense pact with Egypt on May 30, joined the war and attacked Israeli positions in West Jerusalem and Netanya. By the end of the war, Israel had dramatically expanded its territory, capturing the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The outcome of this war had profound and lasting effects on the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, effects that continue to shape the region today. The Suez Crisis and its aftermath. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was a turning point in Middle Eastern history. Though Egypt suffered a military defeat, it achieved a political victory, as international diplomatic pressure, particularly from the United States and the Soviet Union, forced Israel, Britain, and France to withdraw their forces from the Sinai Peninsula. This marked a critical moment leading up to the Six-Day War. Following the crisis, Egypt allowed UN peacekeeping forces to be stationed in Sinai to prevent Palestinian militant groups from crossing into Israeli territory. Egypt also reopened the Straits of Tiran, allowing Israeli ships to resume passage, a key factor that had initially triggered the Suez Crisis. As a result, the border between Egypt and Israel remained relatively calm for a time. Despite this fragile stability, no lasting solution emerged from the aftermath of the 1956 war. No Arab country recognized the State of Israel. Syria, aligned with the Soviet bloc, launched repeated military provocations against Israel during the early 1960s as part of a broader anti-colonial struggle. The Second Arab Defeat, in the Six-Day War of 1967, deepened Arab resentment and increased their determination to confront Israel. To defend itself from renewed threats, Israel occupied Gaza, the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Sinai Peninsula. In 1966, Israel's Prime Minister unexpectedly suffered a heart attack, and Golda Meir, at age 70, was appointed acting Prime Minister. After taking office, she declared that Israel's ultimate goal was peace with its neighbors. She called for direct negotiations with Arab leaders anywhere, whether in their capitals, at the United Nations, or even in neutral countries. However, Arab states refused to meet with Israel. Because Israel refused to return the territories it had seized during the Six-Day War, it faced backlash not only from its enemies but also from allies. Even the United States, Israel's strongest supporter, began to view Golda Meir as inflexible and unwilling to compromise. During a meeting in Rome, the Pope asked Meir why Israel would not show some leniency toward Arab demands. She replied, "Your Holiness, do you know what my earliest memory is? It is hiding during a pogrom in Kiev." She continued, "My people have known nothing but suffering, and we know what it means to be shown no mercy when we were herded into Nazi gas chambers." Golda Meir once posed the question, what would happen if we returned to the pre-1967 borders? Her answer, "We've been attacked from there before. The Arabs remain committed to our destruction. How can we possibly trust that peace would follow?" 3 years later, in 1970, Egypt's new leader Anwar Sadat began rebuilding the country's military with Soviet support. Then, on October 6, 1973, during Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched a massive surprise attack on Israel. Caught off guard and unprepared, Israeli forces suffered heavy losses and were forced to retreat. However, they regrouped and mounted a fierce counteroffensive. Once again, Israel achieved an unexpected and decisive victory. This conflict became known as the Yom Kippur War, named after the sacred Jewish holiday on which it began. Arab nations launched the war believing that Israel would be vulnerable during its religious observances. Aftermath of the Arab-Israeli wars, shifting borders and human tragedy. Following 3 consecutive wars between Israel and the Arab states, the political geography of the Middle East was dramatically reshaped, bringing with it severe consequences. After the 1967 war, Israel expanded its territorial control over Palestine, initially seizing around 5% of the land, and eventually up to 75%. Then, after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Israel effectively took full control of Palestinian territory. Not only that, but after the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel also captured the Golan Heights from Syria and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. These successive conflicts created devastating consequences for the Arab-Palestinian people. More than 700,000 were displaced from their homeland and forced to become refugees in neighboring Arab countries such as Syria, Egypt, and Lebanon. Meanwhile, over 200,000 Palestinians remained in the occupied territories, including the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Over time, these Palestinian refugees began organizing a resistance movement. In 1964, this effort crystallized into the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, with the aim of reclaiming Palestinian land. Let us now focus briefly on the Gaza Strip, a coastal region along the Mediterranean Sea, bordering Egypt to the southwest and Israel to the east and north. It stretches 41 kilometers in length and varies between 5 to 12 kilometers in width, covering a total area of 360 square kilometers. Although not recognized as an independent state by the international community, Gaza is governed by the Palestinian people. Since June 2007, Hamas, an Islamist political and militant group, has held de facto control of the region after winning an internal power struggle. Egypt had previously administered Gaza from 1948 to 1967, before it fell under Israeli occupation from 1967 to 2005. Under a legal agreement between Israel and Palestine, Israel maintained control over Gaza's airspace, coastal waters, and border crossings, effectively enforcing a blockade. Today, Gaza City remains the most important urban center in the region, home to over 4 million Palestinian Arabs. Historical roots of Gaza and the Palestinian identity. Gaza's history traces back to the 15th century BCE. Ancient texts, including the Torah and findings from archaeology, recount events in which figures such as Samson are said to have died in Gaza after destroying a Philistine temple. By the 13th century BCE, the area was controlled by the Philistines, a seafaring people who dominated the coastal regions. The name Palestine itself is derived from Philistia, as recorded in both Greek and Latin sources. Over the past 2,000 years, Gaza has changed hands many times. Yet it was eventually conquered by the Israelites under King David, according to historical and biblical tradition. Civil war in Lebanon, a spillover effect. One of the gravest long-term consequences of the ongoing Arab-Israeli wars was the outbreak of civil war in Lebanon. The regional conflict, displacement of Palestinian refugees, and the presence of armed groups helped ignite internal strife within Lebanon, further destabilizing the Middle East. In the early 1970s, southern Lebanon became the largest refuge for displaced Palestinians. This was due to Syria and Jordan closing their borders and expelling Palestinian refugees from their territories, forcing them to migrate into Lebanon. Once inside Lebanon, many Palestinian refugees, who were predominantly Muslim, formed alliances with the country's Islamic communities. Tensions quickly rose as these groups clashed with Christian communities, triggering the outbreak of a brutal civil war in April 1975. Concerned that the Lebanese civil war might spill over its borders, Syria intervened later that same year by deploying troops into Lebanon, under the pretext of restoring order. This marked the beginning of a long period of instability and foreign dominance in Lebanon. Syrian forces occupied a large part of northern Lebanon, while Palestinian factions took control of much of the south, including several districts of the capital, Beirut. violent clashes between Muslim and Christian militias became a daily occurrence in the city. In 1978, fearing the civil war might threaten its own national security, Israel invaded southern Lebanon. 4 years later, in 1982, Israel launched a full-scale military campaign known as Operation Peace for Galilee, aimed at pushing Palestinian militants farther away from Israel's northern border. However, due to international pressure, Israel eventually withdrew most of its forces, leaving Syria in near-total control of Lebanon. By the 1980s, the broader Arab-Israeli conflict had increasingly narrowed into a direct struggle between Palestinians and Israel. Many Arab nations began withdrawing their support, showing less commitment to the Palestinian cause. Egypt, which had previously led 2 major wars against Israel, signed a peace treaty with the Jewish state in 1979, marking a turning point in regional dynamics. In 1982, Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization (PLO), was forced to leave Beirut under pressure from Israel. With regional support dwindling, resistance began to grow from within the occupied Palestinian territories themselves. In December 1987, a grassroots uprising erupted in areas like Gaza. Armed with little more than stones, Palestinians confronted Israeli soldiers, marking the beginning of what would later be called the First Intifada, or the War of Stones. This led to renewed international efforts for peace. In 1991, both sides participated in a global conference in Madrid, followed by a series of secret negotiations held in Oslo, Norway, from January to September 1993. On September 18, 1993, Israel and the PLO signed the Oslo Accords in Washington, D.C. Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin stood together as the world watched with hope. It seemed that peace and the possibility of 2 nations coexisting peacefully were finally within reach. But the reality proved more complicated. The Oslo Accords were only meant to be a 5-year interim agreement, 1993 to 1998, intended to pave the way for the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state. Israel was supposed to gradually withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza and hand over administrative control to the Palestinian Authority, led by Arafat. However, in practice, Israel failed to fully implement the agreement. By the end of the interim period, the Palestinian Authority controlled only about 3% of the West Bank. Moreover, the Oslo Accords made no mention of the fate of hundreds of thousands of Jewish settlers who had lived in these areas since 1967. This opened the door for extremist groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad to reject Oslo altogether. They vowed to continue their armed resistance, with the ultimate goal of destroying Israel. In 1991, Hamas carried out its first suicide bombing. Just 4 years later, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who had signed the Oslo Accords, was assassinated by a right-wing extremist on November 4, 1995. His death dealt a serious blow to the peace process. Since 1995, violence has once again flared up in the Middle East. In the Palestinian territories, the militant group Hamas began launching suicide bombings, while the Israeli government responded with heavy-handed military force, deploying artillery, fighter jets, and tanks, often impacting the civilian population indiscriminately. In the year 2000, U.S. President Bill Clinton hosted a high-stakes peace summit at Camp David, bringing together Israeli and Palestinian leaders in an attempt to resolve critical issues such as the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, and territorial disputes. However, the summit ended without any agreement. Both sides failed to reach a consensus. From 2006 onwards, internal civil conflict between the 2 major Palestinian factions, Fatah and Hamas, further destabilized the situation. As a result, the Palestinian territories of Gaza and the West Bank were plunged into chaos, severely weakening peace negotiations with Israel. In January 2006, Hamas, a hardline Islamist movement, won a majority in the Palestinian elections, gaining control over both Gaza and the West Bank. A coalition government was briefly formed with Fatah, the political wing of the Palestine Liberation Organization. However, the international community refused to recognize the Hamas-led government due to its extremist views and refusal to acknowledge Israel's right to exist. Hamas had openly declared its intent to destroy the Jewish state. This led many Western nations to withdraw aid to the Palestinian Authority. As a result, the Gaza Strip plunged into an economic and humanitarian crisis. Tensions between Hamas and Fatah escalated into violent conflict, and eventually, the 2 groups split. Hamas took full control of Gaza, while the West Bank remained under the control of Fatah. From Israel's perspective, the rise of Hamas in Gaza represented a looming catastrophe. The militant group continued to launch suicide attacks and reportedly received weapons and funding from Iran. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, the Hezbollah militia launched rocket attacks into Israeli territory in July 2006 and captured 2 Israeli soldiers. Israel retaliated with a 34-day military campaign targeting Hezbollah strongholds in southern Lebanon. Like his predecessors, U.S. President Barack Obama, America's 44th president, sought to broker lasting peace between Israel and Palestine. Yet despite his efforts, peace remained elusive. In his first term, Obama exerted significant pressure on Israel to re-engage in talks with the Palestinians. He even warned Israeli leadership not to undermine American diplomatic efforts in the region, hinting that failure to cooperate could lead to a reassessment of political, financial, and military support from the United States. Obama also appointed George Mitchell as his special envoy to the Middle East, tasked with addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. However, Israel was unhappy with Mitchell's appointment, largely due to his belief that peace could never be achieved in the region as long as the U.S. continued to offer Israel unconditional support. In truth, building peace in the Middle East, especially between Israel and Palestine, has proven to be a near impossible challenge. The Palestinian leadership itself is divided. Hamas remains committed to Israel's destruction, while Fatah appears more willing to engage in negotiations. On the Israeli side, there is ongoing resistance to the creation of an independent Palestinian state on land Israel claims as its own. For more than 70 years, since the establishment of the State of Israel on May 14, 1948, the Middle East has been plagued by war and continuous tragedy. Peace remains a distant dream for many in the region. The newly established State of Israel had to struggle for its very survival from the very beginning. It was immediately confronted by hostile neighboring Arab countries such as Palestine, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and others, who formed alliances and waged wars against Israel with the goal of erasing the Jewish state from the map of the Middle East. However, in each of the 3 major wars that followed, it was Israel that ultimately emerged victorious, often humiliating its opponents on the battlefield. The first war broke out on May 15, 1948, just 1 day after Israel declared its independence. The second came in 1967, known famously as the Six-Day War. And the third occurred in 1973, during the Yom Kippur War. With every victory, Israel expanded its territory, capturing more land from the surrounding Arab nations. As a result, the Palestinian people have continuously lost territory, a process that continues to this day. One of the greatest obstacles to peace between Israel and Palestine is the internal division and growing extremism on both sides. Even after the Oslo Accords were signed, efforts to implement the agreements failed. Hardline Israeli factions refused to allow the government to relinquish control of occupied Palestinian lands and refused to withdraw from territories already seized. On the Palestinian side, extremist groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad rejected the Oslo Accords entirely and remained committed to the destruction of Israel. This ongoing conflict has led Hamas to carry out suicide bombings and other acts of terrorism against Israeli civilians. In retaliation, Israel has launched airstrikes, tank assaults, and heavy artillery fire, often causing widespread casualties among Palestinian civilians. In 2024, a recent round of conflict between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip lasted more than 20 days. It claimed the lives of 1,212 Palestinians. Israel reported that 61 of its soldiers were also killed. In total, the fighting left more than 9,080 people wounded, among them 2,744 children and 1,750 women. Then, on the morning of Saturday, October 7, 2023, Hamas fired a barrage of rockets from Gaza into southern Israel, killing at least 22 people and injuring more than 500. Although many of the rockets were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome air defense system, sirens wailed across southern and central Israel, forcing civilians to seek shelter from the incoming attacks. As of July 2024, the war between Israel and Palestine showed no signs of slowing down. In fact, the violence has only escalated. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to completely eradicate Hamas from the Gaza Strip. In pursuit of this goal, Israel intensified its air raids, launched ground operations into Gaza, and sealed off the entire territory. Meanwhile, massive protests erupted in the West Bank, as Palestinians called for an end to the war and a return to peace. This brings us to a haunting question. How will this centuries-long conflict between Israel and Palestine finally come to an end? Will the United States, the United Nations, or any other global power be able to resolve this deeply rooted and tragic struggle and finally bring peace to the Palestinian people? Thank you for watching. Good luck.